Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Debbie Esposito, and I'm one of the co-directors of the START EPSD project. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Inclusion, What Parents Can Do. Thank you for joining us. I'd now like to introduce Tatiana Dagrosa, who will talk about SPAN, the START EPSD project, and introduce our team. Tatiana?
Thank you, Debbie. Good afternoon, everyone. SPAN, Parent Advocacy Network, is a statewide organization that is federally funded by the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Special Education Programs, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and multiple state agencies and foundations. SPAN is an umbrella organization that focuses on education, health, parent leadership, and human services. Some of our programs include Parent Training and Information Center, Special Education Volunteer Advocates, New Jersey Statewide Parent to Parent, New Jersey Inclusive Child Care Project, and START Engaging Parents of Students with Disabilities in Schools. We call START EPSD. So START EPSD project is a partnership between the New Jersey Department of Education, Office of Special Education Programs, and SPAN. We offer programs and services that support the engagement of families to improve outcomes for students with disabilities, including developing and sustaining special education parent advisory groups, or CPADs, and other parent support groups in communities and school districts. Through workshops, regional meetings, and parent leadership development activities, we help parents and parent leaders to become informed and active participants in their child's education, partner with educators in improving educational programs for students with disabilities, particularly in the area of inclusion, start and strengthen CPADs and other support groups, and build their capacity to improve special education programs, policy, and practices in school districts and communities. And please meet our team. All 7 of us serve as parent group specialists. In addition, Debbie Esposito and I, Tatiana Dagrosa, co-directing the project, and Debbie also our literacy project coordinator. Monique N.J.A.C. Wilson is the New Jersey Tier System of Supports project coordinator, and Brenda Figueroa is the inclusion project coordinator. You can learn more about our team by visiting our webpage, and I will share the link in the chat box shortly. Thank you.
Thank you, Tatiana. Okay, so now we have a couple of questions that will help us find out who is in the room. So our first polling question is, are you attending this webinar as and the options are parent or guardian, general education teacher, special education teacher, school district staff, or something else or other. Please select the appropriate response and click submit. So it looks like 71% of you have voted. If you haven't responded, go ahead and I'll close the poll in a few seconds. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. And I'm going to share that with everybody. So it looks like 65% of you are guardians or parents or guardians. So thank you for that. And our next poll question is, how old are your children or the children that you teach?
Okay, thank you. It looks like 56% were parents of 9th graders and up. So now I'm going to give the webinar overview. And in today's webinar, we will learn the benefits of inclusion for all students, hear from self-advocates about their experiences with inclusion, and learn about our resources on inclusion and our upcoming training series. Next slide. What does inclusion mean for you?
Going from like everybody.
Okay. Do you like to be in the school playing with everyone?
Yes.
Why?
Making friends.
For making friends, awesome.
Hi everybody, my name is Ava Boas, and today I want to talk to you about inclusion. So first things first, I have what's called a system. So that means I was born profoundly deaf and I'm slowly losing my vision over time. So inclusion to me means that you have the proper accommodations that allow you to be successful in and out of the classroom. So I think the reason that people with disabilities get so frustrated about inclusion is that they're not given the proper accommodations that allow them to be 100%. So I think the reason that I've had such a good experience with inclusion is because our Manchester school district has been so receptive. Like the administrators, teachers, lunch aides, paras, and peers have all been so understanding with what I have. So remember, inclusion means all.
And now a few words from Khalil Jimenez and what inclusion means to him. It means I'm just one of the guys, that nobody judges me because of my disability. I am just another volunteer firefighter doing what I love to do, serving my community. Next slide. So what is inclusion? Inclusion is about all of us. Inclusion is a legal, moral, ethical, and civil right. Inclusion is about living full lives. It's about learning to live together. Inclusion makes the world our classroom. It considers that all students are full members of the school community and are entitled to the opportunities and responsibilities available to all students in the school. With proper preparation and support, everyone benefits from an inclusive approach to education. Inclusion is a value. Inclusion treasures diversity and builds stronger communities. Inclusion is about our abilities, our gifts, and how to share them. Inclusion is not just a disability issue. Inclusion is a way of living. Next slide. Let's hear from Danny Philippi on what is inclusion. Play video.
It's basically, it's like, I'm going to put things into sports terms. It's like having the same playbook for all the members of a team. It's like you don't, it's like if you have a, and I use football as an example because you have 11 players on the field at once trying to accomplish the same goal, and you've got all the players have to perform these plays, and all the plays have to have certain jobs for these for players to be in position to succeed. And I feel like that's like my personal definition of inclusion, because if one player out of the football team does not have the same playbook, how can the rest of the players be able to perform the play successfully?
Now that we've given you an overview of today's webinar and discussed briefly why inclusion is so important, we'd like to know a little bit about your experience with inclusion and your child's education. So the question, our next poll question is, what percentage of time does your child spend in general education, in a general education setting? And the options are less than 40%, 40 to 79%, 80% or more. My child is in a separate school for students with disabilities or a separate placement, or I'm not sure. So go ahead and select the appropriate response and click submit. So it looks like 44% of you, 48% are voting. So go ahead and click the best response or the most accurate response to the best of your ability, and I'll close the voting in a minute. Okay, 60% of you. I'm going to go ahead and close, and I'm going to share that with you. So it looks like 80% of you, 47% of you, or the majority of you, say that your child is included 80% or more of the time, and that's great. So let's go ahead. I'll hand it back over to Brenda.
Thank you, Debbie. So now let's take a look at inclusion according to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA 2004, and it states that to the maximum extent appropriate, children with disabilities are educated with children who are non-disabled, and special classes, separate schooling, or other removal of children with disabilities from the general education classroom occurs only when education in regular classes with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. Almost 30 years of research and experience has demonstrated that the education of children with disabilities can be made more effective by having high expectations for such children and ensuring their access to the general education curriculum in the regular classroom to the maximum extent possible. And this is the introduction to the Individuals with Disabilities Act, the actual law supported by Congress. It states that a regular classroom with proper supports is the best for all students. So, inclusion according to the New Jersey Administrative Code, Title 6A, Chapter 14, Subchapter 3.7K. It states that for those students in a separate setting, the IEP team shall, on an annual basis, consider activities necessary to transition the student to a less restrictive placement. The IEP determines placement based on each child's unique and individual needs. Please note that as a parent, you are an important member of the IEP team. Also, at 14 or earlier, if appropriate, the student should be part of the team as well. These decisions are reviewed each year at the annual review meeting. Not every student needs can be met in an inclusive setting at all times. The regulations are very clear that this decision must be reviewed each year and that the team consider activities and services to prepare the student to transition to a less restrictive placement. In other words, having goals and objectives aimed at teaching the student the skills needed to be successful in a less restrictive setting. Keep in mind that students change and their needs change. We should not assume that once a student is in a more restrictive setting, they must remain there. Next slide.
Thank you, Brenda. So now we're going to look at the research on inclusion. The National Longitudinal Transition Study has found that students, including students with disabilities, has resulted in higher test scores, fewer absences, less referrals for behavioral issues, and better outcomes for employment and independent living. Today, inclusion is not just about children with disabilities. There are research-based educational practices that contribute to the success of children with disabilities in an inclusive setting. They include universal design for learning, differentiated instruction, gen ed and special ed teacher collaboration. These practices are part and parcel of what experts consider best practice for all children in our increasingly multi-ability classrooms. The focus is on bringing together resources and expertise to meet the needs of all children. The Individual with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, of 2004 states, quote, "Disability is a natural part of the human experience and in no way diminishes the right of individuals to participate in or contribute to society." Next slide. The research on inclusion. Students with disabilities in inclusive classrooms have increased achievement in reading and math, increased classroom participation, and gains in social skills and friendships. They have high expectations that can lead children with disabilities to develop more confidence, independence, and a stronger sense of self. Not only does inclusion benefit the academic outcomes, but it also helps improve a child's social skills and self-confidence. So, let's review what we have discussed so far. We have learned inclusion is about all of us. Inclusion is not a disability issue. Inclusion is supported by federal and state law, and research supports inclusion for everyone. The research on inclusive education paper also found adverse effects of self-contained classes. So let's talk a little bit about the effects of segregation. It results in IEPs of lower quality, a lack of generalizing skills, less interaction with peers and role models, and lower teacher confidence. Inclusive education has become so controversial because it involves a fundamental paradigm shift in the approach to education. Inclusive learning communities assume significantly different learning outcomes than those generally accepted by the existing education community. Inclusive classrooms seek to actively engage all students within a community to participate to the fullest of their ability. In many respects, this approach to education attempts to unify children, parents, and the community by bridging the gap between disabled children and the community as a whole. Studies have shown that 58% of time spent in a self-contained classroom was classified as non-instructional, compared to 35% of the time in a gen ed classroom. Research also showed that when students were moved from self-contained to the gen ed classroom setting, there was a significant increase in the quality of the IEP. In the self-contained classroom, there was a lack of time that students spent on instruction, and the instruction that did occur was primarily provided by the paraprofessional. There were few opportunities for students to respond to instructional cues. There was a high level of distractions in the classroom, a lack of communication supports for students, and a lack of individualization of instruction. Research consistently paints a picture that depicts students with disabilities who are educated in segregated special education placements as receiving less instruction, having fewer opportunities to learn, and fewer opportunities to use knowledge and skills during instruction and other meaningful activities. So what's the alternative? I want to be sure you understand what inclusion is and what it feels like. So let's clarify our definition some more. Either you are included or you are excluded. Based on the definition of inclusion we discussed earlier, which boils down to just being and feeling a part of something, there are basic and truthful differences between inclusion and exclusion. The change starts when we shift the mindset from excluding to including. So here are examples. We are not equal in value or capacity versus everyone has unique value and capacity. Some will learn, some won't, versus all students can learn. Only some are needed to contribute versus everyone has a contribution to make. Everyone will benefit from the knowledge and skills of a few versus everyone has a chance to contribute. Brenda?
Thank you, Stephanie. We have heard about the effects of segregation, but let's hear how it felt directly from those that were affected by it. Next slide. Soami Feliciano is a 13-year-old who loves reading, crafts, and makeup. Soami was 5 years old when an accident changed her life. She suffered a traumatic brain injury and a spinal cord injury. Recovery was long and hard, to say the least. She missed her second semester of kindergarten and missed weeks at a time after that due to surgeries and rehab. She fell behind academically. At that time, her school district insisted that in order to catch her up and provide her with an individualized education, placement should be in a self-contained classroom. Soami did not make any meaningful gains while in a self-contained classroom. Once she was back in the general education classroom with proper supports and accommodations, she started to make gains, which motivated her and helped with her self-esteem. And she provided us with this statement on how it felt to be in a segregated setting. These are her words. I felt very left out from the other classrooms and students. They would treat me like I didn't know anything. They always wanted to help me in every single thing when I was capable of doing it myself. Next slide. And now let's hear from Danny Philippi.
How did you feel to be in a segregated setting?
It felt like there was, I'm going to use an example like another sports example there was once a story there's a story about this, I'll give you the details. The Dallas Cowboys had this coach named Jimmy Johnson. And he coached the Dallas Cowboys from being one of the worst teams in the NFL to being Super Bowl champions. And he would describe it as like if their star quarterback were sleeping in a meeting, and if you had another player that was less than the star quarterback, like less popular or not as well known or whatever, if he was sleeping in the meeting, if these two players were sleeping in the meeting, he would say, if you have the guy that's sleeping that's not as good, and the star quarterback sleeping in the same meeting, that is not a good sign, because if you have it basically the reflection of what happens within a group or within a team or within a school works from the top down. And it sort of like for my opinion, like the child study team is like a reflection of what the school district is like. And in my opinion, if a school district is segregating individuals that have disabilities in a way in which you don't raise their level to where they need to be in order to be a productive part of this mechanism, then it is doomed to be a bad experience, not just for the person that is in the school district, but it is a bad reflection of your organization as a whole.
Wow, thank you, Danny. He's holding everybody, the entire team, accountable. So inclusion starts with the belief that all students have the right to feel safe, supported, and included at school and in the community. And there are significant benefits for students with disabilities who are included. By including children with special needs in school and community programs, we help to share a vision that all children are entitled to learn, to interact with their peers, to develop self-esteem and to feel good about themselves, to learn that they can overcome personal circumstances, and that they can believe in their own future, that they have the ability and the right to dream just like all children should. Inclusion also provides the same rights as other children to be accepted, to have friends. They are provided with opportunities to develop friendships with peers that do not have disabilities. They have the right to participate in the community and the right to be the best they can be. They're provided with realistic life experiences that prepare them to live in the community. And according to the poll, I think we had a number of participants who are already, their children are in the 9th grade and up. And so this right to be the best you can be provides and creates a greater likelihood of employment and happiness as an adult in an integrated community and work environments where inclusion assists children with special needs to become a contributing member of society, just like everyone else. Next slide. Many schools and parents make the argument that typical peers may be negatively impacted by the presence of students with disabilities, especially those students with behavior problems. I'm sure that a lot of us have heard that. But a 1998 study out of Montana found that inclusion does not compromise a typical student's academic or social outcome. I'm going to repeat that. Inclusion does not compromise a typical student's academic or social outcome. So as children's early learning experiences influence whether or not they grow up to value, accept, and comfortably interact with a diverse community, by including children with special needs in school and programs with typically developing peers, all of our children learn to develop skills in dealing with each other. Typically developing children learn about friendships and compassion and respect for individual differences. And as children develop their abilities to relate to others, they start to build new interactional skills, communication skills and social skills, problem-solving abilities, and increased self-esteem. And this paves the way for the development of positive adult relationships with a variety of people in the community and in the home and places of worship and the workplace. So inclusion benefits all. Inclusion is, simply put, a right. It's the right thing to do, and it is the law. Brenda?
Thank you, Monique. So let's review. We learned about the effects of segregation and heard from self-advocates about their own experiences in a segregated setting. We discussed the benefits of inclusion for both students with disabilities and students without disabilities. Next slide. And now in this portion, we will discuss some of our resources available to everyone. Next slide. Our inclusion resource collection. You can find the resource collection on our Start Engaging Parents of Students with Disability page on the SPAN website. This collection of resources on inclusion, developed and reviewed by the SPAN Start Engaging Parents of Students with Disability project in collaboration with the New Jersey Office of Special Education Programs, specifically for families to use in supporting their children and leading inclusive lives. So what kind of resources can you find? You can find one-pagers, infographics, briefs, videos, fact sheets, training materials, websites, webinars, and resources in Spanish and more. It consists of 4 parts, which we will quickly review. Next slide. And these are a few screenshots of what you will be seeing on the website. So the contents of the collection, the first part is the benefits of inclusion. And this section will help families and others build their knowledge base and understanding of inclusion. You will also find a copy of this webinar recording on this section of our collection. Next slide. Now, inclusion in education. This section is to help families and others build their knowledge base and understanding around inclusive education. And you can find the webinar on planning for an inclusive classroom. You can find preparing your young children for inclusion of children with disabilities in the classroom, which is a very helpful blog. And one of my personal favorites, the role of the paraprofessional in the inclusive class, which is a very interesting webinar that has plenty of resources on this topic. Next slide. Next, we have the strategies and tips for families. And this section provides resources and relevant websites on inclusion with user-friendly information and practical tips to support and empower parents as partners in improving their child's academic and social emotional growth by increasing opportunities for successful inclusion. And some of these includes a webpage from our Center for Parent Information and Resources website, which is Priority Best Practices in Self-Advocacy Skill Building. We also have Common Vocabulary in Inclusive Schools, and this is an interactive slideshow. And you can find on our handouts today, also here on our resource collection, the New Jersey Coalition for Inclusive Education Parent Manual, a Guide to Inclusion for Families. Next slide. And last is the additional resources. And here you will find resources, including some from the New Jersey State Department of Education, some directly from our SPAN Parent Advocacy Network, and we've also included one on neurodiversity, which is also available in Spanish. Please keep in mind that our collection will continue to be updated regularly, and we will be adding more statements and videos from our self-advocates. Next slide. So now we will take some time to answer some of the questions that were submitted through registration, and if there are any in the chat box, we will also take the time to answer some of those. So the first one that we received was, how do you get your child to make friends?
I could take that question, Brenda.
Thank you.
So, and I could focus on the, more in the elementary school and preschool piece with making friends. A couple things you could do. One is talk to your building principal, and find out if they do something at school like a buddy bench or a lunch bunch. Those are always great ways. The other thing you could do is at your IEP meeting, talk to the child study team about creating goals specifically around that, with social goals. A lot of times, what is the barrier that's causing your child to struggle with making friends? Is it initiating the conversation? Is it maintaining a lasting conversation, having the conversational skills? So maybe it's looking at first have a goal around initiating, then once that child masters that, going into expanding into conversational skills. This can also be done in conjunction with the school guidance counselor. Invite your guidance counselor to the IEP meeting. The guidance counselor typically in schools will run those lunch bunch or buddy bench type of activities and programs. There may also be a Project Unify or a Sports Unify type of program that is going on within your school district that you can find out and see about having your child participate in. So those are just some strategies, but certainly going into that IEP meeting, we always talk about making sure that those goals are specific. So really honing in on what are some of the challenges that your child might have in making friends, and identifying those as some things within the goals. Brenda, do you want to talk about maybe middle school and high school?
Yes, I want to make sure we address that because we realize that the majority of the parents are ninth grade and up. From my personal experience, the dynamics kind of shift when we're talking about middle school and high school. Sometimes creating these moments to include students changes a little bit, because these dynamics change also for typical children. So we have to keep that in mind. We can't really force relationships, but this is when strengths and interests come into play. This is how our kids will learn to interact. My experience was that even with my son who has a limited verbal ability, at that time, he was able to interact with the kids because he loved playing Uno, and so did they, and they realized he knew the rules better than they did. So that became a common thing. Video games sometimes, whether we like it or not, become that source of connection for them. And another thing that helped my child specifically was sports, those interests in sports and those abilities. You will also find on our website a video by Danny Philippi where he explains about this topic as well. And we have another question here. Oh, I want to keep in mind that I saw one of the comments said awareness and educate the peers, and I think that is very important. Sometimes we talk about inclusion in schools and we just keep mentioning, but we're not really spreading the true awareness and educating their peers in order for them to understand these dynamics. Next question, how to collaborate with my child's teacher when he or she has limited knowledge of what inclusion is?
I'll take that question, Brenda. One of the things that you can do is that you have to assume that perhaps the teacher hasn't been exposed to inclusion or doesn't know how to include your child. So opening the lines of conversation early on in the year is very important. Having a meeting to discuss what your goals for your child are and ideas of how to include them, and also sharing resources that you come across, just like sharing this webinar with the teacher. and giving them some of those answers. And just in the question that Brenda was touching on, awareness and educating their peers, it is very important also that if you have PTOs, PTAs, or HSAs in your schools, that you get involved, because some of the activities that they do, and that has been my experience, sometimes the people that are involved are not aware or are not being
Sensitive?
not sensitive. They don't know what they don't know, and they are not being intentional in the way that they promote events. So having a voice for the parents that have children with disabilities in those groups is very important. Let's say they had a no parent party. A lot of the parents that have children with disabilities will say, well, if there are no parents, are they going to be unattended? Just reaching out and saying, maybe have a disclaimer that there is going to be adult supervision. So just having your voice everywhere within the school district, so people are intentional in including our children.
And I want to add one thing. One of the things is when we consistently include our children, those supports then become natural supports. I'll give an example. Because my son was included in middle school, beginning of the middle of 7th grade and on, now that he's a senior in high school, I didn't have to ask for any special supports or accommodation for prom because he already had those natural supports. The chaperones that were there for the other kids were also his teachers, understood my son, and so did his peers. And it was a successful event where the supports happened in a natural way. So I just wanted to make that example. So we have another question. How can our CPAC, which is a Special Education Parent Advisory Council or group, help educate the public and the Board of Education on best practices for inclusion?
I'll tackle that, Brenda. First and foremost, I think both having the public as well as the Board of Education listen to this webinar would be amazing. The content within this webinar is so full in regards to resources, hearing directly from those children and those young people that are being supported and how they feel about inclusion, as well as the information around best practices. Also, a CPAC or a CPAG provides direct input to school district leaders about policies and programs and practices and services that have an impact on students with disabilities and their families. A CPAC can really increase the proactive, productive involvement of families by inviting their input in ways that can be used to shape those local special education policy or inclusive practices. So a CPAC is an information sharing entity. They are a trusted entity. So they can be that platform whereby providing input about what parents want, about providing input about suggestions and their own experiences and the opportunities to include successfully, that can really create that opportunity to make change into how a district thinks about inclusion and what type of practices they have both within their districts and within their classrooms.
Thank you, Monique. Are there any questions in the chat room, ladies?
No, not right now.
And I want to make sure that I let everybody know that any question we didn't address that was sent through registration or in the chat box that we might have missed, we will respond to them individually via email.
I think there was a question that Monique just pretty much addressed. I want to make sure that we also answer it. Question states, what happens when the school administrators aren't really willing to create an activity or group? What instead feels that by having these students attend the same school or class with typically developing students should be sufficient? I think Monique just answered this question, I believe. Is that correct?
And we will probably send out some more resources on that, but having someone in the same school does not mean that they are included. We will also have some more information on how Swami Feliciano answered some of her questions, and one of them did include how having a paraprofessional limited her from making friends. So please check back on our inclusion resources so you can get more of that information. So, and our last question before we go along with some more resources, it is what tools, staff, or etc., does a classroom need, one-on-one staff aside, to work as an inclusion model classroom?
So I'll take this. I'll try to answer this one to the best of my ability. So we have to remember first and foremost that inclusion is not a place. So when you talk about an inclusion classroom, inclusion is not a place. It's kind of a state of it's a state of mind. It's a way of living. It's a way of addressing a child's needs. And having said that, to how your classroom is set up, what's in your classroom, the way you teach is going to depend entirely on the needs of the student that's being included. So what's going to work in one classroom may not work in another classroom because the makeup of the students are going to be different. So, and there are different supports that are available, and Monique will talk about one of those supports in terms of N.J.A.C, New Jersey Tiered Systems of Supports. There are Universal Design for Learning. There are technical supports that are available. So again, I mean, the supports or the way the classroom is set up will be depending on the needs of the child. And we have to focus, remember, always on the needs of the student. And always, again, remember that inclusion is not a place. It is a way of life or a way of a state of mind. And if anyone wants to add to that.
Yeah. I'd like to jump in and just say that it's also just about your attitude. It's about the teacher in the classroom, the principal of the building, all the way up to the superintendent of the school district that chooses to embrace that phrase, choose to include. And it's really, it really starts at the top, and just building on that attitude that all children belong. And it's that having that attitude that this is the right setting for our children, and we will do whatever it takes to create that inclusive setting for everyone. So I always do reference that in my head, that kind of choose to include, and figuring out how to work with your school district to infuse that feeling throughout.
And I want to say a quote from, I hope I'm getting his name right, Patrick Shorts. We cannot expect our adults with disabilities to lead full inclusive lives if all they know is a segregated setting. So please keep that in mind. And now we'll go on to our next slide. Monique?
Yes. So we're actually promoting our next Lunch and Learn webinar, which will take place on Thursday, June 27th, 12 noon to 1, asking you to grab your lunch and join us so that you can learn a little bit about what New Jersey's tiered systems of support is and how it promotes student behavior and learning through a multi-tiered systems of support. Make no mistake that the New Jersey Tiered System of Supports is not exclusive to special education. This is about struggling learners, and it can also be a supplemental support to those who may be getting special education supports and services. This model is around a multi-tiered systems of supports and a response to intervention that promotes support that is targeted, it's data-driven, and inclusive of all students, and making use of the type of resources that are currently available in school districts. It's a way to be proactive instead of reactive, and in hopes that before students fail, that we have some type of prerequisite of support. So join us so that you can find out what New Jersey is doing around their multi-tiered systems of support and the framework that they are using in order to create successful opportunities for students. Brenda?
Okay. Thank you, Monique. And now we will discuss a little bit about our inclusion training series, which is upcoming. So who can this series benefit? It can benefit parents, professionals, everyone. It is completely free. And what is it? It's a 2-part series that is hands-on, interactive training on inclusion. And where will they be? We will have regional training sessions in the North, South, and Central. And we're starting off, so save the date, with our South series in the Millville Public Library, August 7th and 14th from 6 to 7:30. An email flyer will be sent out to all attendees. Dates and locations for the North and Central series will be available soon. Next slide. Now, remember to use the hashtag #InclusionMeansAll to spread awareness and promote inclusive practices. Play.
Inclusion means all.
Inclusion means all.
Inclusion means all.
Inclusion means all.
Luke, what does inclusion mean to you? Inclusion means all. Thank you.
Next slide.
That's
Tatiana?
great. That's great. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending today's webinar, Inclusion, What Parents Can Do. Special thanks to Danny Philippi, Marianne Philippi, Alicia Ochoa, Luke Babbitts, Eva Bolus, Zoami Feliciana, Khalil, and Norberto Jimenez for contributing to this presentation. Please remember to complete the evaluation at the end of this webinar. You will receive a follow-up email tomorrow with a special message from the Caffrey family. On behalf of SPAN and our presenters, thank you for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of your day.